this day of commemoration, we recall the past. During the first half of the 20th century, 2 world wars were fought and millions of civilians and servicemen lost their health, their lives, their homes. How could this happen? How is it possible that nations, having lived at peace with one another, go to war? How can it happen that educated citizens commit atrocities against other educated citizens, whom they have not even known before? We will never forget the enormous sacrifices it required the Allies to let freedom, democracy, and the rule of law prevail. The German prisoners of war who are buried here bear witness to these efforts. The dead silently remind us of failure and disorientation to which human life is always subject to. We will not forget and are here today to reinforce the memory of all lives lost and all past suffering.
Imagine yourself on a warm Sunday afternoon in the small Appalachian village of Hot Springs, North Carolina. It is 1917. The warm sun brightens the deep colors of hardwood trees that paint the mountainsides along the French Broad River as it lazily courses through western North Carolina like a life-giving artery. It is water that lures your attention in this tableau of green mountain and blue sky. Whether it be the French Broad, meandering its way westward toward Knoxville and its appointed meeting with its big sister, the mighty Tennessee, or Spring Creek, which winds for 17 miles through pastures and hollows and small villages, joining the French Broad at Hot Springs, or the town's most coveted resource, a thermal spring, the only one of its kind in North Carolina. Water has always been the town's lifeblood, the source of the earth's bounty, the connection with larger cities to the south and west, Hot Springs' reason for being. A breath of wind wafts through the hollow, waving Mrs. Brown's freshly washed sheets like flags. The breeze is a welcome relief from the heat. Jane Gentry emerges from her large wood-frame boarding house in the middle of town, Sunnybank its name, and makes her way along the dusty street to the train depot. She is dressed in her Sunday finest, white linen blouse, gray skirt, and a white felt hat with its wide brim trimmed with a light blue ribbon. William Frisbee joins her, he in his dark suit and bowler hat. He owns a modest 2-story white house on Spring Street. As the pair strolls along Bridge Street, they are joined by other townspeople on their way to the depot. As they near the train depot, a lone voice calls out in German.
Bitte spielen Sie die Einführung ein bisschen langsamer. Fangen wir von vorne an.
Neither Jane Gentry nor William Frisbee understand what is being said and pay little heed to it. They have grown accustomed to hearing German in town. They have grown accustomed to the visitors who came involuntarily to their small mountain village. And this Sunday, like every Sunday for the past month, they have grown accustomed to making their way down Bridge Street to the train depot and listening to the music performed live and in concert by the German Imperial Band.
The German Imperial Band was not created there. It was brought, from a ship in the Japanese waters. It was, they had their instruments with them, their uniforms, etc. And so, of course, they continued to play and practice and gave concerts on Sunday afternoons. And the townspeople from all over the county would come and listen to that outside the compound, of course. And my father's sister was one of the young persons at that time, and she said the music was lovely. She was a musician herself, and she said it was the highlight of the week.
The train depot is now full of townspeople gathered along the rail, sitting in chairs or on quilts on the platform. The conductor raises his baton, and on cue, melodious sounds of trumpet, trombone, and French horn resound over the low-slung stockade walls and echo across the French Broad River and around the hills. The deep thump from a pennant-decorated timpani punctuates the martial tempo of Robert Schumann's sailor song, Matrosenlied, as male voices harmonize with the band.
Trinken wollen wir den kühlen Wein und die Gläser sollen dazu klingen, denn es muss geschehen sein. Gib mir deine Hand, deine weiße Hand. Leb wohl, mein Schatz, leb wohl, mein Schatz, leb wohl, lebe wohl, denn wir
A typical Sunday in the life of the small mountain town of Hot Springs in the late summer of 1917. Typical except for an unusual set of circumstances that led to almost 2,200 German enemy aliens being interned on the grounds of the town's elegant Mountain Park Hotel. World War I had come to Hot Springs, North Carolina in a most intimate way. Native Americans were the first to discover the 100-plus degree mineral water from which the town of Hot Springs received its name. Traders from the colonies came next, and by 1778, the lame and the sick were traveling over the mountains to the hot spring for the healing waters. On February 15, 1808, William Nielsen bought a 2-acre tract in what was then known as Warm Springs for 200 pounds in Virginia currency. Only after the land in 1831 found its way into the possession of Asheville merchant James Patton did Warm Springs realize its potential by catering to visitors who sought the healing properties of the thermal spring. In 1828, Buncombe Turnpike was completed along the French Broad River through Hot Springs, connecting Tennessee and Kentucky to the East Coast. Buncombe Turnpike was the superhighway of the South at the time. Farmers drove thousands of horses, cattle, hogs, and other livestock to markets in Charleston and Augusta on the turnpike, and stopped in Hot Springs to eat, drink, trade stories, sing, play music, as well as take the waters along the way. From the late 1820s to the spring of 1861, trade on the Buncombe Turnpike flourished. By 1837, at the height of the Buncombe Turnpike's heyday, James Patton had built the 350-room Warm Springs Hotel with 13 tall columns commemorating the first colonies. Because of its size and grandeur, it was called Patton's White House. Its dining room could seat 600.
The Warm Springs, in a fertile valley of more than 1,000 acres of almost perfectly level land on the French Broad River near the Tennessee line, are surrounded on all sides by the highest mountain ranges east of the Mississippi River, presenting some of the most magnificent scenery in the United States. Points of interest and places of delightful resort, mountain elevations from which the tourist views the extended ranges of the Blue Ridge and Allegheny Mountains, looking into 6 different states, all presenting nature's finest panorama, are in close proximity to the Warm Springs Hotel. In its local surroundings, scenery, salubrity of climate, altitude, and perpetual freedom from fogs, dampness, and insect pests, this resort has no superior and few, if any, equals in America. Warm Springs Hotel advertisement.
Among the Warm Springs Hotel's frequent visitors was Wade Hampton, famed Confederate general and later governor of South Carolina. Wade Hampton's love for Warm Springs and the hospitality offered by Patton's White House led him to build a cottage behind the hotel for his private use. In 1862, Patton sold the springs and hotel to James H. Rumbow, a stagecoach operator from Greenville, Tennessee. Rumbow, a sympathizer of the Confederate cause, left Greenville, a Union stronghold at the time, and moved his family and servants into Hampton Cottage. A few months later, he volunteered for the Confederate Army. The Civil War raged on. While Mr. Rumbow was away aiding the Confederate cause by procuring supplies and horses for the 14th Tennessee Battalion, his Warm Springs Hotel was not immune from the conflict. Raided by both Union and Confederate troops, the hotel managed to withstand these threats due to the courage of its doyenne, Caroline Rumbow, who was forced to hide horses and valuables, divide her food with the soldiers, play the piano for their amusement, and on one occasion she even cradled the head of a dying Union soldier, just a boy, who was then buried in the upper lawn. When the war ended, the Warm Springs Hotel once again became the gathering place for well-heeled guests who came for the spring's healing waters. In 1882, the long-awaited railroad made its way to the mountains. Rails were laid where much of the turnpike's roadbed had been. The drover's era of western North Carolina ended, and the age of the iron horse had begun. With the advent of the railroad, Rumbow enlarged his hotel. 2 years later, the hotel burned, and the springs and much of the town were sold to the Southern Improvement Company, a northern syndicate created by major railroad interests, but was widely seen as part of John D. Rockefeller's early efforts to organize and control the oil and natural gas industries in the United States. During the rebuilding of the hotel resort, a second, even hotter thermal spring was discovered, prompting the new owners to rename the town Hot Springs. When completed, the Mountain Park Hotel was one of the most elegant resorts in the country, with its own barn and stables, a spring house, and a bathhouse of 16 marble pools surrounded by landscaped lawns with croquet and tennis courts. The Mountain Park Hotel also established the first organized golf club in the Southeast, the Wanaluna Golf Club, a 9-hole course. With the completion of the Mountain Park, the town began to thrive, and prominent visitors began to arrive, including the famed author from Greensboro, O. Henry, who spent his honeymoon at the Mountain Park. The future looked bright for Hot Springs. But almost as soon as prosperity had made its home in Hot Springs, the Southern Improvement Company fell on financial hard times and was forced to sell the hotel to Colonel Rumbow's eldest son, James Edwin. Unfortunately, the Mountain Park was never able to regain the stature it had once enjoyed. The Great Flood in July of 1916 devastated Wanalua Golf Club and much of the hotel and its facilities. With America's entrance into World War I, fewer and fewer people traveled long distances to take the waters. The one-time centerpiece of elegance had become a shell of what it once was. It was time for a new direction, and that direction would soon be realized. It was James Edwin Rumbo's ingenuity, combined with a bit of good timing, that saved the mountain park, at least temporarily. Hearing that the Federal Department of Immigration was looking for a site to intern several German nationals, James Rumbo convinced the United States government that Hot Springs was the ideal place to house the German internment camp.
When Rumbo somehow knew that they were searching for a place to put these German nationals, he contacted the immigration office, the Hampton descendant, and said, you know, why not use our place? It's far from the ocean, and it's 100 acres, and has a facility to house these sailors and officers and so forth. So they made a deal, and the deal was that at the end of the usage by the government, it would be returned to its former condition.
But before any internee arrived, preparations had to be made. The town had approximately 2 months to create a city nearly 3 times larger than its native population. Mountain industriousness and hard work would be put to the test. The townspeople gathered what they had and started to work. The mountain park was emptied of its guests, and hastily built tar paper and wooden batten barracks and service buildings were erected in the spacious lawns. Trenches were dug for water and sewer lines. Electric and telephone lines were strung, and perimeter fencing of wood and barbed wire were completed. Small buildings dotted the perimeter of the resort encampment, including warehouses, post offices, dormitories for personnel, a jail, and guardhouses. Hampton Cottage was transformed into the camp's hospital. The choice of Hot Springs as the site of a federal internment camp meant that a substantial infusion of money would come to the village for infrastructure. Supplies of sorts, courtesy of the United States government, began arriving to Hot Springs. Lumber, roofing, screening, electrical and plumbing material, cement, nails, locks, bolts, not to mention stores of necessities like bedding and food had to be procured. A large number of jobs suddenly became available to a depressed region. Nearly 100 people from the town and the surrounding county were hired as guards. Support staff, plumbers, electricians, cooks, even farmers paid to provide dairy products and vegetables were employed. There was little time to prepare, only a month or so, but the value of industriousness, so ingrained in the mountain community, paid off. All was made ready in double time. Who would these invaders be? Townspeople, no doubt, feared an onslaught of German spies, or worse, amoral combatants who were not afraid to kill Americans without the slightest provocation. They waited with curiosity and more than a bit of trepidation, but their wait was not long to be. Then the invaders came. The first group of German internees arrived in Hot Springs on June 8, 1917. The enemy aliens who alighted from train cars at the Hot Springs depot were not at all what the townsfolk expected. They wore no uniforms, carried no weapons. In fact, as the Asheville Citizen reported, the opposite seemed the case.
58 more Germans have arrived, 5 of whom are officers, easily distinguished from the 53 seamen. Blonde, blue-eyed, deep of chest, broad of shoulder, The stalwart-looking, fair-skinned Teutons are a cheerful lot on the whole. There seems to be plenty of money among the sailors. They are a most accommodating set, and the trip so far has been most pleasant, said one of the guards. Of widely varying ages and occupations, the Germans had one of the sailors' traditional solaces in common. They all liked tobacco. The Asheville Citizen, June 1917.
They were mostly ships, crews from ships in American harbors. They had been brought there and they were at Ellis Island and so forth, and maybe didn't know what to do with them. You know, they couldn't keep them there forever. And then, but some were just nationals picked up in the United States, and one crew was actually picked up in Japanese waters. That was the German Imperial Band, and they came to Hot Springs and added greatly to the flavor of the whole camp during that time.
They came from merchant and passenger ships that happened to be moored in American ports at the time. Ships with such monikers as the SS Wittekind, the America, Kronprinzessin Cecilia, and the Vaterland, then the largest ship in the world. The internees were neither battle-hardened veterans, nor had they been sequestered for battle in the war's land or sea theaters. They were not technically called enemy combatants, but they did arrive with skills as barbers, machinists, chefs, butchers, boilermakers, masseurs, and musicians. Some were people of means, who had established themselves as officers in the imperial merchant fleet. Among them were commodores and captains, first and second officers, navigation specialists, and engineers.
They weren't military people, so to speak. A few of these officers were in reserve, in the German reserves, but by and large they weren't combatants. They were, you know, just happened to be caught up in the bad situation.
Standing on the train depot platform, townspeople would watch the Germanies, as they were called by the locals, disembark. The Germanies would be marched to the Mountain Park Hotel, processed, and assigned supplies and lodging. Officers remained at the hotel, insisting that they not intermingle with the crewmen. And even though the camp was segregated according to rank, there seemed to be an air of contentment among the prisoners. One detainee even wrote a thank you note to an official with the Department of Immigration in Washington.
I beg to be allowed to express my heartfelt thanks for your unlimited benevolence toward me and my family, and for the troublesome efforts you undergo on my behalf. I also wish to state that all, without exception, are exceedingly satisfied with the conditions that the United States arranged for us at Hot Springs, and that this human, kind treatment is also appreciated.
Captain and the crew were, of course, imprisoned there, and they brought their wives with them, and some of them, not everybody, but the particular captain of the Vaterland did have his wife in Hot Springs, and she often would come over to the Rumbo House, which is now called Mountain Magnolia Inn, and sit and have tea in the afternoons with Mrs. Rumbo and look right down over the grounds of the prison camp.
Mrs. Jane Gentry's large Victorian boarding house, Sunnybank, was filled to capacity with wives and children of internees. The house, which sits atop a rise overlooking the Appalachian Trail, has played a major role in the life and history of Hot Springs. Besides housing internees' families, Sunnybank was a stopping place for Englishmen Cecil Sharp and Olive Dame Campbell as they traveled throughout the southern Appalachians to collect traditional folk songs for their opus, English Folk Songs from the Southern Appalachians. It now serves as one of the town's hostels for hikers making their way from Georgia to Maine on the Appalachian Trail. Current owner Elmer Hall recalls the stories of the German families who boarded at Sunnybank in the late 19-teens.
A few families, I think mostly the captains of the various ships, were allowed to bring their families with them. The wives primarily, I don't think there were any children that I've ever heard of, but the wives were boarded out in town. Hot Springs had 3 or 4 boarding houses down. Sunnybank was just one of those, but at least one German Hausfrau stayed here for 2 years, and she got along very well with the gentries who were running the place, and they became good friends. Even taught them how to do a little bit of German cooking, which lasted for a while in the American family after the Germans were repatriated.
They were pretty well received. The children went to the public school in Hot Springs, and my father's sister was in school with one of the boys, and she said that she and her another friend had a crush on the boy they called German George, and so his name was George Fisher, and so I think they just treated them pretty well normally. I heard of no animosity, and one family continued to write, Christmas cards and correspond after they left Hot Springs. They had calisthenics every morning. There were some classes offered. I think they had to make up their own entertainment, and that's why they had a lot of time on their hands. But the only thing the records showed was calisthenics in the mornings, and they had a roll call, just a head count, as we would, as you do in modern prisons. And other than that, I don't know of anything that would have been required of them. And so I'm sure they were bored, and they were, especially the officers, were people of talent. And even the sailors, just as other nationalities of sailors, were great with their hands. They did things, because they were out on these ships for long periods of time. And so they did the carvings and the woodworking and so forth. And they probably they used a lot of material there on the river, driftwood and that sort of thing. But I'm sure they were allowed to buy materials from the local stores in town. The general feeling, I think, from those whom I interviewed, was that the Germans were very, very smart. They were industrious and intelligent, and did a lot of things with their hands. They were good craftspeople.
Small, intricate ship models made from wooden cigar boxes, inlaid mosaic wooden miscellany boxes, birdhouses, wooden walking sticks, crocheted scarves, embroidered pictures, and paintings were all made and given as gifts to Hot Springs residents or sold. The gentries of Sunnybank commissioned a crew of internees to build an ornate 10 by 12 gazebo. Other residents followed suit and had small gazebos built adjoining their homes. Soon, small huts, little clubhouses as they were described, began to spring up in the camp. These huts were mainly used for reading, letter writing, playing chess, or visiting. In time, in Camp A, the officers' residence, a small village, Little Heidelberg, sprung up on the grounds. Made primarily of driftwood and debris from the Great Flood, this town of small chalets was designed by Captain Slimbach of the SS President, an architect by profession. Each chalet was different from the others, and were carefully crafted from willow limbs and saplings, using triangular, oval, and square patterns. Window boxes and bark baskets were fitted into the walls, and later planted with flowers. Each chalet had an entrance gate and walkway. Most of the chalets were single-room, open-lattice, garden-type houses. but some were much more elaborate. One officer built an elaborate 2-story chalet with balconies on every side. An octagonal tower with 8 Gothic windows graced the front of one of the chalets. The bungalows were not insulated against the winter chill, but most had small stoves made of scrap iron or cast-off bricks. Completing the village, the internees constructed a small church with a tall steeple, Gothic windows, and a rose window over each entrance. The roof and siding were made from flattened tin cans. The entire structure rested on a stone masonry foundation. While the village of Camp A was the most elaborate, internees in Camp B also built an elaborate Heidelberg-type village, complete with leisure huts and a small chapel, only on a smaller scale. The most interesting feature of Little Heidelberg was a carousel of swinging chairs. While wooden canopied chairs suspended from a 20-foot-high canopy of metal and wood swung in a wide circle, music played in the background. The mechanics of the merry-go-round have been lost to history. Some recall it as having been hand-turned, while others remember it being powered mechanically. A feature of note was the meticulously painted murals on the circular walls under the canopy. Ships plying the waters with rural and urban scenes in the background. The carousel was the camp's biggest draw, enticing children and adults alike to take a whirl.
Not a cent has the government provided for this, nor any material except scraps left by the hotel. These villages are monuments to the ingenuity and skill of the Germans as a workman. Donald Gillis, The Asheville Citizen, March 3, 1918.
With the completion of the Heidelberg villages, internees enjoyed a level of freedom and well-being seldom experienced in a prison camp. The medicinal baths were restored, and for a small fee, internees could take the waters as if in a spa in Baden-Baden. Other mates sold their services to their fellow internees, cutting hair, cobbling shoes, laundering clothing, and managing a small canteen where the internees could buy goods not supplied by the U.S. government. Behind this veneer, however, officials of the camp still maintained a strict protocol in terms of what information came into and out of the penitentiary. Letters were censored, as were newspapers. Special attention was paid to circumvent information from secretly being passed on to German agents. And while the intense scrutiny was effective for the most part, the sheer volume of mail sent and received proved difficult to handle. 3 internees, Ferdinand Fliege, J. Nielsen, and Ferdinand Bittner, were singled out by the head of military intelligence in Washington as having passed on sensitive information and photographs to relatives abroad. Increased censorship was then enacted, and few problems occurred afterwards. Despite ever-present security concerns and a few conflicts that arose between prisoners, the townspeople of Hot Springs continued to accept these visitors civilly, even as reports of war atrocities reached western North Carolina. Residents reasoned that the prisoners had nothing whatsoever to do with these acts of violence, no matter what their political viewpoint. One conflict of note between the camp and the town surfaced over food.
There might have been some resentment when it came to the point of the rationing of the foods, and I don't know how, but they knew of the menus at the Mountain Park Hotel. I suppose there were townspeople who maybe were hired as cooks. Maybe it was a printed menu and posted somewhere, I'm not sure. The people resented it when they were having meatless Tuesdays and they could see that the prisoners were having meat on their menus. So I think the government had to change that. The administration had to change that to make so that there was not favoritism for the prisoners.
The plan was hatched by the riverside, and in one of the quaint rooms of Mrs. Gentry's boarding house.
The only escape from the prison here occurred when this woman, this is a town story, they had a German police dog which stayed here with her, their family dog, and she was able to get messages to him via the dog. And so they plotted to get away from here, to escape down the river, down the French Broad River. She rented or got hold of a boat, a small skiff in some way or other, and sent him the message that on a certain night she would be on the other side of the river from the prison camp, and if he could swim across the river, she'd be waiting for him with the dog and the boat. And supposedly this occurred. She sent a little note under his collar to tell him when and where she'd be. And they disappeared. It was the only escape there ever was. And Mrs. Gentry supposedly got a Christmas card from him about 6 months later from Berlin. They wanted to get back in time for Christmas, and they did. And they got this card thanking her for all the time she's been here as a prisoner. So that was the famous German escape story. Then after that, they put wire fences up around the POW camp and brought a regiment of regular army here to act as guards because they were afraid it was going to happen again.
As World War I raged on, the War Department of the United States deemed it necessary to consolidate the internees at Hot Springs with other groups of enemy aliens and enemy combatants. Rumor spread that the Hot Springs internees would soon be transferred to the war prisoner barracks at Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. A sense of dread filled the camp. Not only did they not want to leave their adopted home, but they also knew the reputation of the war prison barracks and its stern commandant, Colonel Charles Penrose.
The anticipated removal of the interns is not welcome news to the Germans, most of whom would rather remain at Hot Springs in idleness than go to a much warmer climate where they will be forced to work hard every day in building roads and other useful occupations. Asheville Citizen, July 18, 1918.
On July 1st, 1918, official word came that the Mountain Park Hotel would continue to be utilized in the war effort, but as a medical facility for American servicemen returning from the war front in France. The interns would be moving, but to where? The answer was unclear. On August 1st, 1918, one of the interns in Camp B mysteriously died. A group of his compatriots fell seriously ill. In the intervening days, more Germans fell ill, more died. The suspect, typhoid. But rumor circulated that the prisoners purposely poisoned themselves, preferring suicide over relocation. By August 5th, 110 prisoners were sick. Every available building was converted to temporary hospitals. However heroic the medical efforts were, the death toll rose. Among the main road of Hot Springs, a wagon cortege wheeled and stepped with a funeral cadence played on the drum. The facilities in Hot Springs were overwhelmed. Plans were made to move the ill prisoners to a government hospital in Asheville. On the chosen date, special trains arrived in Hot Springs to load the sick. The process lasted the entire morning. On the other end, lines of ambulances received the patients and proceeded to the Kenilworth Hospital, where a special ward was created to care for them. When the epidemic ended, 39 internees had died. 24 were buried in Hot Springs, 15 in Riverside Cemetery in Asheville. After a complete investigation, it was discovered that the cause of the epidemic was typhoid. No evidence was found of suicide. According to the Asheville Citizen, The enemy aliens express bitter disinclination to being transferred from the mountain scenery of western North Carolina. Finally, on August 31st, 1918, all the internees had arrived at Fort Oglethorpe. Those too ill to make the trip were transferred to Asheville. By the middle of September, the stockade was torn down, the tenant houses and hotels emptied, the German occupation of the small mountain village of Hot Springs was over. The final remnants of the German presence in Hot Springs were removed in the spring of 1933. A sizable group of local residents ascended the steep road to the Oddfellows Cemetery and began the arduous process of disinterring the remains of those prisoners who had died while interned. Each grave was emptied of physical remains and personal items such as pieces of clothing, uniform buttons, etc. Each set of remains was cataloged and placed in boxes, then put on a train bound for an undisclosed destination. On a sunny November day in 1932, Dr. F.W. von Prittwitz, the German ambassador to the United States, and members of the United States military gathered at the Riverside Cemetery in Asheville to dedicate a memorial to the German nationals who died at the nearby Army Hospital. The memorial still stands in tribute to the fallen. And in one state to the west, amid the rolling hills of the Chattanooga National Cemetery, where memorials commemorate the gallant service of both Union and Confederate soldiers who gave the ultimate sacrifice for their country, there is another marker, a stone obelisk with 92 names, German internees who perished in U.S. internment camps, including those remains disinterred in Hot Springs that spring of 1933. On that bright November day in Asheville, Ambassador von Prittwitz reminded those present at the dedication, "Let this monument for all times remain a reminder to always unite our forces in striving for peace and progress, keeping in mind the hope and promise expressed in the verses of the poet Goethe."
Whoever aspires unceasingly is not beyond redemption.
As seasons passed, amid the tangled underbrush of Oddfellows Cemetery and the neatly manicured lawns of Riverside, his words remind us still. While the modern town of Hot Springs, North Carolina, sits much as it did at the turn of the last century, there is little evidence that a World War I German internment camp existed in this small mountain village. The only vestiges, memories of some of the town's most senior members, and stories handed down from those who remembered the Germanies. The last sentence on a small historical marker sign in town mentions the camp as if in passing. There are no souvenir shops selling German artifacts, no internment camp museum in the middle of town, nothing to physically point to those who were here not of their own volition. But that is not the end of the story for the town of Hot Springs. Today, as in decades past, Hot Springs is a haven for those seeking a relaxing and healthful mountain retreat. Outdoor recreation abounds. Hikers can explore some of the scenic stretches of the 2,100-mile Appalachian Trail, which runs down the main street of town before crossing the French Broad River and climbing back onto the ridgetops. Rafters can shoot the rapids on the French Broad River. Mountain bikers can wind along wooded paths to open meadows with commanding views of the surrounding peaks. Those seeking time for relaxation can simply savor the area's breathtaking scenery while soaking in hot mineral baths in secluded outdoor tubs at the reopened Hot Springs Resort and Spa. The autumn sun still smiles over the mountains of green and skies of blue. The French Broad continues its sinewy courses as it has done for centuries. Thermal spring bubbles up from the depths of the earth. Summer breezes caress hill and river. And if you listen very closely, you might just perceive the quiet strains of Matrosenlied carried upon a zephyr from long ago.